here are my favorite Filipino experiences, or what it means to be Filipino. Honestly, words, I don't know. Words can't really describe what it means to be Filipino, at least for me. My history with my culture has been pretty complex. I feel like I was lucky enough to grow up in a household with Filipino parents that were pretty resistant to white culture and felt that it was important to bring the values and culture that they had back in the homeland, as well as continue experiencing that culture outside of the home. I grew up in really big, multiple Filipino family friend groups, which I feel like, again, I'm very fortunate of. But despite growing up in those groups, I was still an American kid that went to a majority white school. And I feel like that's kind of what made me struggle with being Filipino. I vividly remember going to school and all these kids, doing the little, just Asians in general, like doing the little eye thing where they stretch out and they'd make fun of me because I was Asian. I also remember going to lunch, and I feel like my fear of bringing any food from home, even a sandwich, stems from this. But I remember all the kids thinking that my food was weird and that, like, bringing anything but a sandwich to school was weird. And what was that smell? Why is that white thing over there? Like, even just bringing rice or Filipino spaghetti was weird to my peers. So once I left my house and started going on into my school years, I remember I didn't hate being Filipino, but I felt ashamed to show my culture. And now that I've grown up and have become well rooted into my culture now, I feel ashamed that I felt ashamed back then. I also remember struggling with my own name. I was named after my Filipino grandmother, and I remember always getting made fun of because, believe it or not, the subs would pronounce it wrong my teachers would pronounce it wrong on the first day of school, and the name that I go by now, it just kind of stems out of trying to accommodate to other people that didn't want to take the time to just learn my name or understand my culture. My nickname gets shorter than that because, Filipinos. That also has a complicated history. I remember, like, whenever someone would call me as a young kid, it made me feel loved, it made me feel special, because that was a name that was specifically reserved for my parents and, like, for my Filipino family friends. So as a kid, I always grew up, like, feeling so comforted by hearing the word in a really nice tone. It just made me feel warm and fuzzy inside. But I remember when I was in school and telling all my friends that I had another nickname, I remember getting made fun of, and I felt like ever since then, I've hated the name. But again, as I've grown up, I've learned to love it. I still feel very much at home when someone calls me in, like, that really nice tita voice. But yeah, that's kind of my childhood experiences with being Filipino. Not gonna lie, even though I feel better about showcasing my culture and I'm proud of my culture, there's still part of me, little child inside of me, that's still scared to bring rice to school or tinola when, like, I'm perfectly fine eating it at home. Like, for some reason it tastes good at home and at Filipino parties and when I'm around my Filipino friends, but when I'm at school or with people that aren't familiar to my culture, even whether they're the nicest people in the world, I still feel the embarrassment from bringing anything but a sandwich to lunch. I feel like that's really carried, with those emotions have really carried on as the years have gone by. And I don't know, it's kind of ironic because now the same people who were making fun of me bringing pancit or tinola or rice to school are the same friends who are now asking me why I don't bring my own food or asking to try my cultural food, which I'm not trying to gatekeep culture, but I just think that's so interesting now. I really wish that some kids grew up with more cultural perspective and more respect for that, because I don't know, I feel like I could have been a very different kid And like, I would love to feel comfortable bringing Filipino food to school. My favorite Filipino food is sinigang. I love sour soup so much, and like it's smothered in hot rice, like, well, drowning, like rice drowning in sinigang. That's so good. I feel like I really miss the Philippines. The Philippines, I haven't been there in almost 9 years. Wow. That's so crazy for me to think about. I haven't seen my cousins in person for 9 years, my grandmother, because truly on both sides of the family, my mother and father are the only ones that immigrated here to America. So I remember feeling as a kid like super jealous that all my other friends could go to their grandma's house over the weekend, or they could just drive there in 20 minutes while mine were on the opposite side of the world, and I'd have to spend $2,000 on a plane ticket to go. I don't know, it's so weird, especially when my grandfather died. But when he died, I hadn't seen him in 7 years. Yes, 7 years. And like, I don't know, like having family back home, it doesn't really hit you when you're young, but especially when you're older, you just kind of wish that you got to bond to those people and you got to talk and you got to really know them. I know there's a bunch of things that my family and I want to do in the Philippines. When we go to the Philippines, we always plan, but there never seems to be a perfect time for us to go. It really makes me sad, and like I really want to see my country in person instead of through my phone or through a video call. There's just a part of me missing from not having been to the Philippines in so long. I also remember as a kid calling back home and Filipino Wi-Fi, the connection was super bad, and I remember as a kid getting so frustrated at my mom for making me go on the phone and for having to repeat like hello to my grandparents or to my cousins like 10 million times. And now looking back, I'm wondering why I was such a brat, and like, because I would do anything to go back in time to talk to my cousins again, or to talk to my grandparents, to sit through the really bad Wi-Fi and just talk to them. Also, language barrier. Although I said that my parents were pretty resistant to white culture, I feel like out of fear of assimilating into the American lifestyle, they wanted me to learn English. So from what it sounds like, most Filipinos, my first language was not English. Sorry. My first language was not Tagalog or Bisaya, what we speak in my house. It was English. And while I know it was out of care and concern of my parents, I wish that, I learned. I mean, obviously I know a few words and I've been trying to learn, but I just wish that I knew my language, especially so I could communicate with people back home. Like, I know there's many other things that can transcend barriers, but I just wish I could talk to them and have a normal conversation. And I'm lucky that my relatives and my grandparents can speak English pretty well, but again, it's just parts of me missing that I wish I could have, Yeah, I feel like it's kind of interesting that most Filipinos, unlike other Asian cultures where even though the family just immigrated, like, even though the family is first gen, they will teach their second gen kids how to speak their language, and usually their native language is their first language. I find it really interesting that for Filipinos, usually their second gen's first language is English, which I find really interesting. And again, I know that my parents taught me English first because they cared, but I just wish, because, yeah. I also find it interesting that when I was little, even among my Asian friend groups, I never felt like I fit in. Back to the story of being ashamed to bring Filipino food to school, I could only really bring Filipino food if I sat with my Asian friends. And while everyone else sat on the right side of the table, me and my group of Asian friends sat at the very left. And there was basically a table in between of us because no one wanted to go around to our smelly food or abnormal looking rice. even though I felt like I belong with my Asian friends, I feel like being Filipino was super complex to me because the Philippines is a big mixture of cultures in Southeast Asia and very distinct cultures, but it doesn't really seem to blend in, like Hokkien, Chinese, and Spanish roots in our language, but like most of Southeast Asia are Muslims or have their own religion while the Philippines is Catholic, and there's just a bunch of stuff where it's like I fit in with that group but not like my Hispanic friends. I felt like I fit in with them and like, you know, house values, Catholicism, and family values, but not completely because I was Asian. But when I went to my Asian friends, you know, Asian parents, Asian values were the same, but the food was not really the same. Yeah, like being Filipino, it's kind of complicated. Like no words can really fit to describe what it means to be Filipino to me. The Filipino family values though, again, with like my parents really tried to keep Filipino family values, and that kind of resulted in tension between my mom and I. Again, I love my mom and I know that everything she does is for the best for me, and I know that her transitioning into the American lifestyle was nothing but easy for her, but sometimes the incorporated Filipino family values and familial standards does not go the same way here in America, and it's hard for Filipino parents to understand that. I know I'm not the only Filipino kid. Bruised tensions between my mother and I, like, yeah, I guess that's kind of what it means to be Filipino. But I'm happy that over the past few years, I've been able to embrace my culture more. I've been trying to learn, but I don't know. It's funny because as much as our parents have tried to get us to assimilate, to keep the Filipino culture, they've also tried to get us to assimilate to the American lifestyle. And yet, when you act so distant or when you try the culture, it's again, feeling as a Filipino American, you really never feel like you belong anywhere. Like with your other friends at school, unless if they're Filipino, you're not Asian enough to be Asian or you're not Hispanic enough to be Hispanic. But also with being Filipino American, you're not American enough to be American, but you're also not Filipino enough to be Filipino. I remember going through my quote-unquote whitewashed phase where I tried to act like really quote-unquote American or white to please my white majority elementary school, and I never fit in because simply I wasn't white. But I remember also trying to learn the language or speak to my relatives in Bisaya. I'd always get made fun of because I sounded too white or anything like that. Like I wasn't Filipino enough to be Filipino. So being Filipino American, I feel like you just sit in this weird medium where you don't really feel like you belong anywhere except under the category of Filipino American. So yeah, but I don't know. Over the years, I've learned to embrace my culture though, and I'm very happy that I've tried to, even though I'll never be Filipino enough for my relatives or for my parents, I can always try more and more to be more Filipino, even though I'll never get there. And I feel like that's what I'm trying to focus on now, trying to really get to know my culture on the other side of the world. And I feel like I'm finding more and more of myself as I'm trying to do it. Like it makes me happy to learn about my culture and to teach people about my culture. Yeah, I feel like it makes me really happy, but I hope I learn to embrace my culture more because it's a very important part of me. I will admit that if I ever do raise a family, one of my biggest fears is not having enough Filipino culture retained in me to pass down. And so while having kids in my future is kind of a big question, it's something that I want to make sure that in case if I do, I have culture to pass down.